Hey class, so in this video, I'm going to talk about the basics of Adobe After Effects. After Effects is the animation program that we're going to use for this section of the class. If you're an animation major, you will probably use Adobe Animate in Animation 260. So if this doesn't look like the kind of animation you were expecting to do, where you're drawing frame by frame, that's really the software that you would use for that. After Effects is really more used for post-production, so it's adding, it sounds like it sounds, After Effects. You take video or animation and then you add effects to it afterwards. But since we're not all necessarily animation majors or artists or drawers, we're just going to use this as kind of a basic way to do some very simple animation using some of the really basic concepts that are important to animation. So we're going to talk about, creating a project. We're going to talk about setting things up, setting up our layers, and then keyframing is kind of the main concept that we're going to look at in this video. So we're going to learn how to use some keyframes, which are really important for basically all styles of animation, regardless of what kind of technique you're using or where you're starting. So we'll use this as a way to kind of demonstrate that. So After Effects is part of your Adobe Creative Suite. Just like Photoshop and Illustrator, you should be able to download it once you've registered your Adobe account from the school. If you have any issues with that, let me know, we can go over it. But when you open After Effects, you're going to see something that looks like this. You might see some pop-ups that say, do you want to do some tutorials and things like that, which you are welcome to do. We're going to skip those for now, and I'm just going to go over some of the basics. So yeah, when you get to After Effects, you're going to see a window like this. We're going to create a new project. So I'm just going to click on this new project button, and it's going to open up to a window that looks like this. This is kind of our default setup for After Effects. So I'll go over some of the basics that we see here. First, let's save this project file. So I'm going to go to File and Save As, and just click Save As here. If you're using the Adobe Cloud, it may say, do you want to save this on your computer? Make sure that you save it on your computer. We had some issues with that in the previous lessons. So just make sure that you're saving a file on your computer. You can save it in the Adobe Cloud if you want to. That's convenient for if you're using different computers or something like that. But for this project, you're going to want to eventually have a file on your computer that you can submit through Blackboard. You can see the file extension here is .aep. I'm going to click on this drop down so I can see where I am on my computer. I'm going to go to Documents, go to my MMP 100 folder, go to the Animation folder, and I'm just going to call this, I'm animating Madness, so let's just go ahead and call this Madness. You can name this after whatever you're doing your project on. So if you're doing an emotion, you can name it after the emotion. If you're not sure what you're doing, just call it My Animation or Animation. If you're doing something, with a different premise, that's fine. Just name it whatever makes sense. I'm going to click Save. And so the interface looks very similar to Photoshop and Illustrator, of course. We can resize our windows if we want to. We can go to the window and open up different types of workspaces. So there's things for doing motion tracking. There's things for doing text. We're just going to go with the default, and I probably won't actually change too much. Like in Photoshop, I tend to move my layers over so they're easier to see, but I think with After Effects, we'll pretty much just leave things the way they are. We have a few basic areas. Over here is our project panel. This is where all our files and footage are going to be. Here we have our composition panel. This is where we're going to actually see what we're editing. Over here, we have a bunch of different panels related to different properties, and we'll use these when we set the properties for different components. And down here, we have our timeline. So this is where most of the editing is going to be. The interface for After Effects, everything is a little bit smaller than what you're probably used to, and that's because you're going to end up having like a lot of layers and a lot of things. So that's one thing that I think is a little tricky for people at first, is that everything is kind of small in After Effects. I'm not really sure why. But that's kind of how it's set up. There's also a toolbar up here at the top with some basic tools, and I'll talk about those as we use them. But let's go ahead and get started with with a new composition. So you can see there's two ways to get started. One is a new composition where you just start from scratch. Most of the time, what you actually do with After Effects is new composition from footage. You bring footage from a film or an animation in here and add post-processing to it. We're just going to create a new composition, so I'm going to click on this button. And here we have some settings that we want to say. Okay, so we're going to call this composition name. I'm going to call this my main composition. So in this video, we're just going to have one composition, but in a later video, we'll have multiple compositions that kind of go together. Then we can set some settings. The basic HD 1920 by 1080 is perfectly fine, so you can just leave that as the default. 1920 by 1080 is kind of the high def standard, so most like YouTube videos and digital video use that standard. Of course, we are kind of moving into 4K. A lot of stuff is actually a higher resolution now, but for what we're doing, this will be fine. Then we want to make sure to change the duration. The default duration is 30 seconds. When we look at this time code, basically these two zeros at the right are frames, so however many frames there are in the animation per second. Then it's the number of seconds, so this is 30 seconds. Then it goes to minutes. We have 0 minutes here, and then hours. We're just going to make a 10-second long animation. So the first thing you want to do is change that 30 to a 10. And that's going to be fine. And then you can change the background color if you want. I'm actually going to set the background color to black because we're going to fade in the background. That's one of the first things that we'll look at doing. So then I'm going to click OK. And now we have our composition. So you can see here's our main composition over in our project panel. We can see the black background of our composition here. I can zoom in and out by using the scroll wheel on my mouse. If you have like a mouse like I do that has like a little scroll wheel, you'll be able to do that. If not, that's okay. You can set the zoom setting here so you can fit to the window, or you can choose a specific zoom setting. So I can go to 100%, or I can go to 1.5% or 12.5%. You can set it to whatever. But fit is probably good enough here. And now you can see we have our timeline down here. We don't have any layers yet, so we don't actually have any content, but our timeline is where we're going to do a lot of our editing. So let's go over how to add a couple of really basic, simple animations. So when we first get started, there's different types of footage. Footage is just anything that we see on the screen. And the way we can add footage is either by going to the layer and going to new and adding. You can see there's a few different options: text, there's shapes, adjustments, there's all sorts of different stuff. You can also just right click on the timeline on this this left side here and go to new. And I'm gonna add a solid. A solid is just a solid color. So we're just gonna add that in there. And we can name this, I'm gonna call this background. So I'm gonna fade in my background. And we want it to be the size of our composition, so we're gonna leave that the same. If it's not the same, you can click make comp size and it'll do that. And then we can set a color for this solid. So I'm gonna fade in, and I'm gonna fade into a different color. So I'm doing madness, so let's do like kind of a reddish color, something like that. A little pink. Let's try something like that. Looks pretty good. You can always change this later, so I'm gonna hit OK and hit OK. So now we have a solid, and we just have this background. Let's look at the timeline over here for a second, and then we're gonna do some animating. So in my timeline, I have this blue little triangle with this line. This is called the playhead. This like moves me throughout the animation in the timeline. Then there's two bars. The top bar just changes how much of the timeline I see. So the smaller this is, the less of the animation we see. And that's just so we can zoom in on specific parts of the animation to do some more detailed editing. This larger bar actually sets the duration of the animation. So if I make this smaller, if I make it 1 second and I hit play on the keyboard, let's go back here. You're gonna see that it's gonna loop back to the beginning of that section. So when I export the animation, it'll be the full length, but this is just to loop a section, again, just to do some more detailed editing. So for now, we're gonna kind of leave those alone, but as we do more complex stuff, we're gonna move these around a little bit. This little red bar here is our layer. You can see if I move the layer past the playhead, suddenly we don't see that red color anymore. But if we play, we'll see it come in. So this red bar just kind of determines where this footage appears in the animation. When we create it, it's gonna default to the length of the animation. So if I drag it over here, we're gonna run out, but I can always drag this section here. So if I mouse over the edges of this bar, I'll get this little two-way arrow, and then I can drag this out to the end of the animation. So if you do that by mistake, you can just drag it out, or you can just move it. You can do whatever you need to do here. We don't end up using this a whole ton, this bar, but we'll see, we might need to use it in some cases. Okay, so we've got this timeline. You also see this like little green color that kind of flashes around. Green basically means that it's cached. That means I can play it back at normal speed. So as we add more stuff to the animation, it takes longer for the computer to sort of render everything together. So put all our layers together and create our animation. So right now it just takes like a second. You can see the green bar gets generated really quickly. As we add more stuff in, we're gonna see it takes a little bit longer. Okay, so let's actually animate. So we're gonna start just by animating the opacity of this background. And so we do that using keyframes. And where we find our keyframes is inside our layer. So we're gonna go back to this left side over here. And if I click on this little arrow, it's gonna drop down and we're gonna see different components or properties of this solid. And so our transform basically refers to the object itself. Remember in Photoshop, we had transformations where we could scale or rotate or do different things. That's basically what this lets us do. So we can see the anchor point, the position, scale, rotation, and opacity. So let's start with opacity. This is just how transparent or non-transparent it is. And you can see there's a number here, which I can change by dragging my mouse up to 100 or down to 0. I can also just put in a specific number here if I want. And so you can see if I drag this opacity down to 0, now my solid is completely see-through. So we just see the black background. And if I play, it stays that way. If I want to animate one of these properties, you can see there's this little stopwatch. One of the tricky things with animating in After Effects is you just hit the stopwatch once and that animates this property. Once you hit that stopwatch once, you're not going to use it anymore unless you want to get rid of the animation. So just keep that in mind. So if I click on this stopwatch, it adds this little diamond shape here, and that is called a keyframe. That basically saves this value here, and then so when I play back the animation, it's going to go to 0. So that's my first keyframe. Now I'm gonna scroll ahead to 1 second and I'm gonna change my opacity up to 100. Notice that it adds a second keyframe for me. Now let's watch what happens when I play back. We see it fade in over time. So what the computer does is it looks at this number 0 for the opacity, and it looks at this number 100 for the opacity, and then it does the math to figure out what the opacity should be at each frame in between those two keyframes. So we don't have to go through and say the opacity is, we can see if we go frame by frame. Oh, whoops. I don't know why that's moving the position. Can I go this way? No. Okay. I think I'm using my animate, what do you call them? Key commands. Anyway, let's make the window a little bit smaller. So when you see the F there, that means frames. So this is like after 5 frames, you can see the opacity is 17%. After 10 frames, it goes to 33%. 15 frames, it goes to 50, so we're halfway. And then it keeps going up until 100. So that's basically how keyframes work. And the really magical thing about keyframes is you can apply it to any property in the animation. Okay, so we've got our fade in. So that looks pretty good. Let's say we want to fade out. So we would want to go all the way to the end of the animation. And let's stop there. Let's say we want to fade out. So I'll show you something that is very common in animation. So if I want to fade out, I'm going to drag the opacity all the way down to 0. And now we've got this fade out, but the problem is it's going to fade out for this entire 9 seconds. That's not really what I want. I want the image to say solid and then fade out at the very end. So what I can do is go to where I want the fade out to start, and I'm just going to repeat this value here. So it's going to stay at 100%. So I'm going to increase this value to 100%. Notice as soon as I change this number, the keyframe gets added for me. So After Effects is pretty smart. It knows what I'm trying to do there. So now we see we get a fade in to our first value. Then these two values are the same. So we see this just stays the same. It stays at 100% until we hit there, and then it fades out. So that's pretty common. That's something that you'll see in a lot of animations. So again, remember I said the thing about this stopwatch. If I click this again, all of those things go away. So I only really want to use the stopwatch once. If I start again, now I have to start all the way at the beginning. So I'm going to hit Command Z a couple of times to get rid of that. And so now we've got our very quick fade in and fade out. Okay, let's introduce our subject real quick. And so we'll just look at a couple other animation techniques, and then I'll stop and you guys can play around and start to figure stuff out. So one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to lock this layer so I can't accidentally click on it and move it, change the animation. When I'm working in After Effects, I'm going to be clicking around on the screen a lot. Same thing with Photoshop or Illustrator. So if I lock the layer, that'll prevent me from making any changes that I don't want to make. Okay, so I want to add in a shape. So let's add in a basic shape layer. So I'm going to right click, go to New. I'm going to go to Shape Layer. And when we first add it, there's nothing there. It's just a layer, but we're going to add some shapes. So I'm going to add my subject, which is my circle. I'm going to get my ellipse tool, and I'm going to hold Shift to make sure it's an even circle. And I'm just going to add it into the center here. So now you can see my shape layer has inside of the contents an ellipse. And it also has a transform. So one of the things that's a little confusing about After Effects is that we actually have a lot of things that we can animate. I can animate the transform of this whole layer, or I can animate just the ellipse. So the ellipse has its own transform. So you can see as I start to add more stuff, this layer panel over here gets really complicated. We're just going to use this one shape. So I'm just going to name this. I'm going to rename this and call this circle. And just to keep things easier, I'm just going to have one shape per layer. Or I might have a few shapes depending on what I'm doing, but I'm going to animate this main transform instead of the contents. So let's close that down. I want to change the color of my circle. So we can go up to fill, and I'm going to change it to black. And now we can't see it because the background is black, but if we fade in a little bit, we'll see it there. So that looks pretty good. And then for the stroke, I don't need a stroke, so I'm just going to set it to 0. Again, if I need to see what that looks like, I can scroll ahead to here to see what that looks like. And then I'm going to position it in the center. So right now my circle is not centered. If I go to the contents of the circle and go to transform here, you can see what the position is. I'm just going to set this to 0 and 0. And so now you're going to see it's right in the center of our composition. So now I can animate the layer itself, and the circle will go along with it. I'm going to keep things simple for now, but next week I'm going to do a video where I talk about more complex techniques. Excuse me. Okay, so let's animate the circle onto the screen. So I'm going to scroll wheel out and zoom out a little bit, and we're going to animate the position. So I'm going to take my transform, and I'm going to use the arrow tool or the selection tool. I'm going to move this up. So see, as I move this up visually, notice that my position is changing down here. Those numbers are changing around. So when I move this, it changes. I'm going to move this up here, but then I want to set it, I want to keep the position in the middle, which is 960. And so now it's right there. And so right now, it's not keyframed, so it just stays there. We just don't see it. So we want to bring it into the animation. So I'm going to keyframe the position. And the nice thing about position is it's very visual. So if I drag this down, you can actually see that line that shows us that animation. And each one of those dots is a frame. So I'm going to scroll in a little bit. You can see each one of those dots, and we can see our circle go through those dots. So the nice thing about animating the position is it's very visual. I can move this around and we see that updates. I'm going to undo that. So now let's watch that animation. So we've got two things happening at once. We've got our background fading in and our circle coming in. So a couple things, let's make this window, the timeline, a little bit smaller here. So a couple of things, I can move these keyframes. So let's say I want the circle to come in after the fade in starts. I can select both of these keyframes by drawing a box over them with my mouse, and then I can just move them over. So if we move these over a little bit, now we get the fade and then the circle. So if I want them to happen one after the other, if I want them to overlap a little bit, I can move them back here. And there we go. So that's very simple, but that gives you a lot to work with in terms of some basic animation. Okay, so now let's do the wiggling, and then I'm gonna break and let you guys play around with this stuff. I'll go over some more advanced stuff next week. But there are a lot of other things to play with here. So you can play with the scale, you can play with the rotation, although it's a circle, so you're not gonna see that much. But if you had a different shape, you would see stuff there. But let's do our little wiggling. So I'm gonna go up here a little bit, and now I'm just going to kind of move the position around a little bit randomly. So I'll move it over here, move the timeline, and move it up here, move the timeline, move it down here, and move the timeline. So notice that it's just updating. Every time I move the timeline, and then move my circle, it adds a keyframe for me. I can edit those, delete them, move it around, do different stuff, but if I want to just get a little bit of a wiggle, I can just go like this for a while. Okay, so let's play that back and we can see if we like that. Okay, that's pretty good. I might edit that a little bit. I might make these actually closer together so it's even more kind of crazy seeming. Oh, that's pretty good. Okay, so I actually don't like that. I don't think that's too bad. This is just a quick example though. Obviously there's a ton more stuff you can do here. If you like this and you're ready to move on, I would lock this guy, make a new shape layer, and in my storyboard, let's rename this stars. In my storyboard, I had a bunch of stars. So I would go to my shape and get the star tool and add a little star. And I'll zoom in on this a little bit and use the selection tool. So in our star, you can see there's different things that we can animate. Of course, we can change the position, but there's also like a number of points. So you can actually animate how many points there are over time. There's all sorts of stuff in here. So each thing that you add kind of has its own properties. And so you might be able to animate those properties. So make sure to look inside these little sections and see what's out there. So yeah, once we've got our star, I can duplicate this by holding Option, and then I can scale this down, and I'll make a couple more of these. And then I can animate the rotation of this entire layer. So actually we don't want the stars to come in, so I'm just gonna move this over here, and let's move it till after that wiggle animation. Here our stars start. So I could animate the whole transform. So I could, let's start by scaling it from 0. So I'll set 0 on the scale and keyframe that. And then I'll move this up to here and set it to 100. Okay, so we've got our stars kind of appearing, and then let's rotate them around. So if I rotate, they're gonna rotate from the center of the canvas. So let's see. So we can rotate like that. So let's reset this to 0. And I'll keyframe here, and I'll move it up. And you can do the rotation by degrees with this second number, or there's a number of rotations right here. So let's just do like 10 rotations. That's gonna be really crazy. That's maybe too many, but we can drag this keyframe out. And there we go. That's still too many. So 10 is way too many. Let's go to this keyframe. If you wanna edit this number, make sure you're on top of the keyframe, because if I'm not on top of the keyframe, and I do something like here, notice that it's hard to see because they're right next to each other, but it just added a new keyframe right there. So that's something you need to be careful about. But let's change this value to 5, and then let's see how that looks. Okay, so that's a little weird, but you know, just an example. So stars, And then if we want these to overlap, I can start rotating and scaling at the same time. So we can kind of overlap these animations to get a better effect. Okay, so that's a good place to start. I'm gonna stop here. That's just kind of some basic overview. I would play around with this and see if you can get some interesting effects. And then next week, we're gonna look at adding some text and some basic effects as well. And we'll also talk about kind of playing with our keyframes and adding different properties to them. So that's it for this week. Let me know if you guys have any questions, and I'll see you guys. I'll do a review video of the audio projects tomorrow, so I'll see you guys in that video. Or if you have any questions, just send me an email, or we can make an appointment for office hours.